welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week.
I am.
What have you brought to the table today?
I have brought a documentary called Berry Farm, which is a history of a particular area in the southeast portion of Washington, D.C.
Yes.
The documentary opens with a narrator saying, quote, "The history of D.C. is one of community building and displacement. The cycles predate the city. The indigenous Powhatan of the Chesapeake, the Piscataway of Maryland, and along the eastern branch of the Potomac and into Anacostia. And Nacotchtank thrived in villages and towns prior to colonization. These shifts of place and displacement continue to this day with a breakneck pace of gentrification." So this part of DC called Berry Farm at some point became owned by someone named Berry.
Right.
I presume this was his last name.
Yes.
And that land was a plantation, hence Berry Farm. And then a big portion of it was purchased by the Freedmen's Bureau, and formerly enslaved people were invited to purchase a lot and build a house there, which we can talk about how messed up this is later.
Yeah.
And they had to buy it. But then a portion of that land became public housing much later. And now most of that public housing, after years of disinvestment and neglect, has been torn down in favor of so-called public-private development.
Right.
And the people who lived there were told that they would be able to come back and live in the new apartments, but there's some dispute about that.
Yes.
And
some uncertainty there.
Yeah,
right?
there's no clarity in the documentary about who will be able to come back and how many people will be able to come back. And there's a ton in this documentary about the history of DC. They talk about go-go music.
Yeah.
Some of the most famous go-go bands from DC are from Berry Farm. They talk about civil rights organizing that happened in Berry Farm, or people who got started there, and up to the gentrification of the last 15 to 16 years.
Yes.
So yeah, there's a ton of stuff in here.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of great history that for us is fairly local.
Yes.
So it was really nice to watch this and learn more about an area of DC that doesn't get talked about much,
No.
I think, unless we're talking about this redevelopment.
Right.
Or in the 80s and 90s, how scary it was, quote unquote.
Quote unquote there.
So, yeah. What did you think? How did you like it?
I loved it. I thought it was a really great documentary. I thought this was a great opportunity for me to learn more about the history of a neighborhood that's really in our backyard. And it's crazy to me that I didn't know much about Berry Farm and what it has meant for the folks living there, for Black people, not only in DC and in the greater DMV area, but I think just in general. I mean, this is such a historical place that has a lot of rich history and incredible stories.
Yeah.
And,
At the end, some folks call it sacred.
It's sacred, absolutely. And so for me, it was a real joy that we got to watch this film. I'm glad you found it. I'm glad we get to talk about it here on the podcast. There are, as you said, so many folks featured in the film. One of the stories early on that kind of got me a little bit that I wanted to share was the story of Emily Edmondson. And so her great granddaughter, it's either 2 or 3 great granddaughter is featured in the film. And so she was telling the story of Emily. She was an enslaved Black woman in Montgomery County. And the story is about how Emily and her sister and a bunch of other enslaved people tried to escape to Pennsylvania on a boat called the Pearl back in 1848. But in the cover of darkness, they were caught by armed vigilantes. And that story blew my mind in the sense that I didn't know about this story at all, right? And about the Pearl incident. And the Pearl incident, in fact, happens to be the largest recorded nonviolent escape attempt by enslaved people in U.S. history. Yep. Like, what? So there's that. And after enduring the trauma of that experience, enduring the trauma of then being transported down south to be sold into prostitution as sort of punishment for trying to escape enslavement, Emily and her sister were eventually freed. And then Emily purchased land on and moved to Berry Farm, where she lived out the rest of her days, and her family was born into that place and has lived there this whole time. And that to me was just such an incredible story. And it's one of the many reasons why I love doing this podcast, because I get to learn something new, especially when there's history involved. Like, I can't believe I didn't know about the pearl. And, it's certainly, this is a great way to learn about that. But like, just an incredible story about our history, again, down the street, a history of enslaved folks kind of here in the state of Maryland. There's like so much more now that I want to dig into and learn about. But that's just one of many stories in this film.
Yeah, and one of the things that was incredible about that was they talked a little bit about the organizing and fundraising that happened to get them free and so they would not be sold.
Yes.
Down south in Louisiana, I believe it was.
Yes.
So that was done by Frederick Douglass and some other folks
Yes.
in the neighborhood, I suppose.
Yes.
And they also left from the 7th Street Pier, which is a place we've been to quite a few times.
Yes.
And next time we go, I want to look for a historical marker because this deserves one down there.
I'm hoping it's down there.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I would, just love to go see that. But I want to go back to the point that I had started to make about the freed people in the 1860s and
Yes.
70s who were invited to purchase a plot of land from the 375 acres that the Freedmen's Bureau bought from the Berry family. Just wrapping my mind around this, right? Dr. Amber Wiley, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, was talking about this in the film. And she said, I know we always hear about the idea of 40 acres and a mule, but this wasn't even that. This was people who purchased the land. They weren't given the land. Why do these folks even have to buy this land in the first place? I still feel like it was really their birthright to be able to be landowners because that was one of the many things that had been denied them for so long, even though they worked the land themselves.
Yes.
And this, maybe obviously makes me think back to how reparations has never been seriously considered in the federal government at that level.
Right.
And this is an example of how it could have worked way back then.
Yes.
Just giving people plots of land somewhere. And because these people who did buy this plot built houses, they built lives, they built a community for themselves. They took their plots and planted food on it, or they had poultry and livestock, or they opened up a store where they were able to support one another with what they produced in this community. And I wonder what it would have looked like if that had been part of the plan for reparations and what it could have looked like across the country.
Yes.
If this could have just been one small case study for that project in a much bigger sense.
Absolutely. Well, and it would have been an amazing situation where there could have been generational wealth.
Yeah.
Right, if these folks were given this land and able to do all of the incredible things that they did to support themselves as a community, and like you said, they had food, planted food, livestock. They created schools and taught themselves. I mean, they really built a community there, but were already at such a disadvantage, right? Like out the gate. So I love that idea of this could have been a case study, and it could have been something that could have been replicated other places.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, it's not that big of a stretch to go from, the Freedmen's Bureau bought this land, and then they could have allotted it to people who were maybe enslaved on that land and are now freed. Like, there's any number of ways that it could have worked, and it just feels like it would have been it could have set up an entirely different way.
It would have changed our history,
forward.
I think, right?
Yeah.
It could have. It had the potential to. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you shared that bit of the history of this. And one of the things that I think is kind of related, but kind of stood out to me from this was just the idea of the different generations of Berry Farm residents that were featured in this film. And they got to tell the story of growing up there and living their lives there, especially in the early days of Berry Farm. Some of those stories to me really like pulled at my heartstrings because they were just so beautiful. There was so much in those stories about family and community and love and pride that, those stories were just so rich and profound. And it was amazing to hear those stories and to see those pictures and see archival footage of all of that Black life being led and all of the faces of the people telling those stories because they were beaming with pride, talking about their grandparents and their friends and their family and talking about just living their lives on Berry Farm and the pride that they had for it. And of course, so much of that is happening in the midst of institutional and systemic and pervasive racism and white supremacy, right? But to me, all of that was just so beautiful to see and to hear about. And I think when I pushed stop on this film, I just was like, I loved that. I think films like this are so important because we get to see people living their lives and telling their own story,
Yeah.
which I think is so powerful and so profound. And especially getting to see Black people and their families and their communities living fully, supporting each other, as you talked about, living their full humanity out loud is so important for folks to see. And so, that part of the film in particular, like the history and then leading into what it was like to be in the early days of living in Berry Farm was just beautiful to me.
Yeah, the descriptions of some of those things was just really incredible. And it's like, oh, that sounds like a place that I want to live.
Yes.
Anybody would want to live
Yeah.
because people are looking out for each other, and you're getting vegetables from somebody down the street, and you're getting eggs and milk from somebody up the street who has a cow and some chickens.
And people looked out for each other. It was so great. Yeah.
One of the other things that I wanted to talk about that's a little less great is
Okay.
about how this process of gentrification happens and really how it happened with Berry Farm. So they have footage of some meetings and interview a few of the Berry Farm residents who talk about the process that they experienced. So there were notices put on their doors for them to attend meetings, and they discussed, in quotes, discussed the redevelopment project. But the footage they show in the film really seems like this was a process that didn't have a lot of answers for people, or any answers. Somebody, in fact, says, they just told us a bunch of lies.
Yeah.
And someone in the meeting says there are 7,000 people on the wait list to get into the public housing in Berry Farms. And another asks why they're only building 30 units for all of these people who are in the meeting currently, let alone the 7,000 people who are on the wait list. And so not only were people displaced, but it seems like there was confusion all the way through for the process. So people in the film talk about being on their own in the relocation process, and they had 30 days, and the city or whoever was managing the process sent people in to pack up belongings because he was taking too long.
Yep.
And that happened haphazardly without respect to his belongings.
Right.
And so there's just all this stuff that happened to people to beyond being displaced that also there's something to it that is, it's not right. Like we're not treating people
Absolutely
well.
not.
And it's, as of the filming of the documentary, it's still not clear who can come back into the new development,
Right.
which allegedly is built now. And so I'm not sure where we're at with the development, but it's still not clear who can come back and when and where and how even.
Those scenes were particularly infuriating, right? I mean, I think about just this idea of, you hear about this happening in your neighborhood and there's signs on your door to attend these meetings. And so as a community, they went in droves to this meeting and to ask legitimate questions about, where am I going to live? What is your plan for me? And to the disrespect in the answers and the no answers is just so unacceptable when we're talking about people's houses, people's lives. It really shook me to my core. Like how I don't know how I would feel leaving a meeting like that. Like what are we gonna do?
And the order of it seems strange too, because the meeting that we saw footage of, there was somebody managing the plan who was bringing in developers to do a presentation of what their proposal was.
Yes.
Which that's all well and good, but if people don't know where they're going to go in the meantime of this being built, and then where they're going to come back to, like that's not a great order of operations
and order of business.
I think people need to understand how this is all working in the meantime, and then what's it look like for them to come back.
Right.
And then let's talk about what the community looks like, what you're going to build.
Yeah, that's all great and good, but hierarchy of needs,
downstairs.
Right?
Yeah,
like I need to know where the roof over my head is, where I'm going to go, and where I'm coming back to. Right. Period. Yeah. There's so much in this film that was infuriating and lovely and amazing. There was a lot to learn. I think one of the most profound parts of this film was a statement by one of the folks featured in this film, Michael Fisher Jr. He's a professor in the African American and African Studies Department at Ohio State University, and he's also a founding steering committee member of DC Legacy Project, and particularly their initiative around Berry Farm, Hillsdale, which is obviously working to raise awareness about the Black-led struggle for land and housing in DC. And so related to exactly what you were just talking about, he says this: "It seems to me that the evolution of U.S. cities always happens on the back of Black communities. The destruction, the demise of Black communities becomes an acceptable sacrifice as cities seek to develop and to grow." And I was like, we need an air horn right there. Like that should be the documentary's tagline, right?
Yeah.
It's
like one of the first things said. That first part of that quote is one of the first things said in the documentary too.
Oh,
Like they pull that quote out of
missed that.
context, and it's right there at the beginning of like they're happening on the back of
that's
Black
brilliant
communities.
filmmaking then and brilliant editing, because I missed that. But when he said it towards the end of this film, I was like, that's it. That's exactly what's happening at Berry Farm.
Yeah.
That's also what's happening in so many other cities across the country. And this idea of, instead of investing in Black communities, in those people, in their lives, in the health and well-being of those folks, in things like infrastructure and healthcare and education and social supports, like, cities instead partner with developers to gentrify these places and spaces in order to make money. It's all about money. And these communities are often the targets of gentrification because of who lives there. It's absolutely communities of folks that look like me. That's a huge piece of this too. And so, and we see with a film like this, we see the consequences of that. We have to watch that meeting and you know, obviously we're not experiencing it, but my heart just broke for them. This is real people and real communities that are impacted. It's really sad. But I think that piece about gentrification is spot on.
You talked about the consequences of it. We see people go back now that it's been demolished and look at, this was my mother's house.
Yes.
And one
We played on these steps.
I learned to count on those steps.
Yes.
I did my whole life I lived on these steps. And it's just, it's heartbreaking.
Yes.
To see that and for it to be so confusing that the way that people are displaced and the way that they don't know if they can come back or what they're going to come back to. And
I mean, you were starting to talk about this, but the one older gentleman talked about how he's like, I don't think I can afford to come back. I mean, there's also that piece too of there's probably not enough units for the amount of current residents of Berry Farm, but then also it was unclear who might even be able to afford to live there, which is another huge problem with this as well.
Right, because they were talking about low income as being $59,000, which like the numbers might be a thing. And he was like, I don't know anybody who makes $59,000.
He's like, I sure don't.
I don't make anywhere near that.
Right.
And so they're not going to let me live there.
Oh,
and
my
so
goodness.
that's also a piece of this that's like, you have to understand like who's in your community, and if you're going to redevelop it, so to speak.
Yeah.
What's the impact going to be? And if we're talking about low income housing in the context of a private market, that low income housing rate has to be adjusted. Like you're replacing public housing with these private developments that are allegedly in some kind of public partnership. But if people aren't going to have a place to go anymore because you demolished the public housing, like where's that?
That's a problem.
Like what do you owe to that human who was living in that publicly funded house?
And their family, right?
Yeah.
And their family, absolutely.
All right, well, let's talk about application. How does this film apply to our day-to-day lives? I think one of the things that reminds me of is how much local politics matter.
Yeah.
The way we got into this argument that Berry Farms should be redeveloped is a disinvestment of the public housing that was located there.
Right.
So it fell into such disrepair that the city had a better argument to tear it down and redevelop rather than renovate and maintain. And as much as our national electoral politics suck up all the attention, we have to make sure that our local politicians hear from us and they know that what we need, and we have to pay attention to those elections too, because we have to find tangible ways and solutions to make economic decisions that don't benefit wealthy developers instead of the people. And that's generally happening at the local level. That's where those decisions are made.
Yes.
Your local city council or county council or what have you is what's driving development. And for decades now, progress in cities has looked like private construction via tax breaks for developers in a way that pushes out the people who have lived there for a long time.
100%.
It's gentrification in, so many words. But yeah, so what about you? What's your application?
I love when our application is related. You know, the application of a film like this is absolutely the troubling effects of gentrification and how that has been and continues to be the path taken by cities and states and local governments, as you say, to as the path forward, as opposed to caring for existing communities and people. So to me, the displacement of residents, the loss of history and culture and character, all in the name of gentrification and money is truly shameful. Right. What happened to the residents of Berry Farm is unacceptable, right? Generations of families have lost their homes with no real recourse, no real way to fight it or resist it. Like, I can't fathom a society that allows that to happen and to treats its people like that. But I can fathom it because we're living in it.
Yeah.
And so to me, the application is how can we advocate for and support our local government candidates, our local government leaders who are against this kind of action, who are champions for more inclusive development policies and champions of investing in existing communities and people. We need more of that and less of what we saw in this film.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so much in that, in changing how we go about these things. And if you look, a lot of people are still like pro-development, and it's pro-development at the cost of what?
Right.
And at the cost of so many things.
Absolutely.
All right, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
What do we want to do to continue learning and unlearning beyond our conversation today? My homework this week is to learn more about the work of Empower DC. They were featured a few times in the documentary on T-shirts and on banners, and I think some folks interviewed are affiliated with them directly. And they do some incredible work, and this is one of the ways that they talk about that incredible work on their website. At the root of our work is a deep commitment to stopping the displacement of low-income Black residents from DC, once affectionately known as Chocolate City, during an unprecedented time of gentrification.
Nice.
So, yeah, I'd love to learn more about Empower DC and see what they're doing, how we can support them. What about you?
I love that. I'm going to add that. I've got a list of things here.
Okay.
Like, first, I mentioned the story of the Pearl earlier and how I didn't know that story about the Pearl, the boat incident before watching this film. So I want to just read up and learn that history and learn other similar histories that were taking place around the same time, because I'm sure there's a lot I don't know. I would also love, you mentioned the 7th Street Wharf. Like, I think we should go down in DC to the site of Berry Farm, all around it. I hope, and I think part of the work of Empower DC, part of the work of the DC Legacy Project, I think they have partnered with historical preservation societies to put landmarkers out. I think they have plaques, remnants, all that.
Yeah.
And so I would love to go down there and see what's down there and learn more about it. And then I also want to learn more about the DC Legacy Project in general and the other work that they've done here. So there's lots of great work that these local organizations like Empower DC and the DC Legacy Project are doing that, again, this is right in our backyard. So I'd love to learn more about what it is that they're doing and see how I can support.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Well, cool stuff. Great homework to do.
Yeah.
Take some field trips, I guess.
Yes.
Fairly soon. But that's it for our conversation this week about Berry Farm, the documentary. And Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
All right. So for next week, I'm going to bring a toolkit from our friends over at Interrupting Criminalization to the table for us. It's been a while since we've talked about them. This toolkit is called Mapping Community Ecosystems of Collective Care. And it was put together by Shannon Perez Darby and Andrea Ritchie, who we've read a lot from. And of course, they did that work in collaboration with lots of folks from IC. This toolkit, so I clicked through it. There's a lot going on in it. There's lots of activities and exercises for organizers to engage in. So I'm not sure how much of that we might actually do, but I'm excited for us to just talk about it, check out this resource, amplify it here. So here's what they have to say about this toolkit. Since the 2020 uprisings, there has been an explosion of interest, activity, and organizing around community-based approaches to building safer communities free from the violence of policing. Throughout this period, Interrupting Criminalization has been supporting these efforts by sharing expertise built over decades of organizing for and practicing transformative justice-based approaches to building liberatory communities with resources, toolkits, webinars, podcasts, skill shares, trainings, cohorts, and learning and practice spaces. This toolkit emerges from the work of our Creating Community Ecosystems of Collective Care cohort, which launched in March of 2022 and featured over a dozen organizations working in community safety coalitions in Miami, Durham, North Carolina, Seattle, Milwaukee, Phoenix, Minneapolis, and Atlanta. In addition to breaking isolation, cross-pollinating across communities, and creating a virtual community of practice, our goal was to collectively create resources to support communities beyond the cohort who are grappling with similar questions that we could share at the end of the cohort. This toolkit is that vision come to life.
Wow.
Yeah, I read that and I was like, well, this is it. And like I said, it's a brilliant neatly done toolkit and resource, not surprising given that it's interrupting criminalization, but there are definitely pages where they're asking the questions. They want you to sit with your group and engage in these questions to get you to think about and dream about a different world. But there's also just lots of compiled lessons learned and challenges faced and all of that I just think would be really cool for us to check out. So yeah.
Yeah, amazing. I was just thinking about this literally yesterday.
Wow, really?
Yeah, about not this in particular,
okay.
but this idea of what does collective care look like. Particularly, I was thinking about it in the context of conflict intervention.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
That kind of thing, which we've talked about a few times on
Yes.
the podcast in the context of this kind of community-based model. So,
Well, look at that.
Excited to learn more from this and learn more about what this might look like here in our neighborhood.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube. Sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.